Great. Hi, Gretchen. Hi, David. So you're both on, so that's wonderful. And we'll give folks a couple of more minutes to hop on, and then we'll jump in with our discussion. Good morning, everybody. I know this session officially starts in about a minute, but just wanted to start by welcoming everybody. And I know we're in a Zoom call format, so throughout throughout our chat, I know we'll have official, designated time for Q&A towards the end of the conversation. But please, I'll be monitoring the chat if you want to enter questions throughout the conversation. We can insert them throughout. We got a nice sized group today, so lend itself well to conversation. So just make sure you can enter resources in the chat, or you can let us know if you have questions via throughout our discussion, so we can always ask them earlier. We don't have to wait till the end. And so if you are in the Zoom chat, you can either send it to everyone or send it to me, Rebecca Rehr. You can scroll down and click on my name and send the questions to me, and I'll make sure that we get to ask them. So I just encourage folks you don't have to hold your question to the end. You can ask earlier. So, and then see, most folks are joining via Zoom, and we welcome you to turn on your cameras if you'd like. And I know the speakers and the moderator will all keep our cameras on the whole time, but welcome you as well to turn your cameras on if you want. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and get started. So hi everybody, welcome. You're in the Zoom room for Trump administration environmental policies, the impact of even more executive branch rollbacks on EJ communities. And Gretchen and David have given this presentation at prior symposia as well, and thrilled to be back this year as things change rapidly and frequently. So really appreciate everyone's time joining us today to have this chat, for your ongoing work on environmental justice and achieving health equity, and look forward to our discussion today. I'm Rebecca Rehr. I'm the director of the Climate for Health program at ecoAmerica, and I'm here joining you from Washington, D.C. And so as a way of introduction, we're actually going to start. The first question is just to Gretchen and David, to ask them to introduce themselves, their organizations, and how did you come to environmental justice work, either prior to joining where you are now or as a part of your ongoing work. So we'll start with a question to introduce yourselves to the audience here. And again, I welcome the audience to type in your questions throughout. Let us know where you're joining from, and answer the questions along with us. So we want to make this really interactive. So use the chat frequently, and I'll turn it over to Gretchen to start.
All right, great. Thanks so much, Rebecca. So my name is Gretchen Goldman. I'm the research director in the Center for Science and Democracy at the Union of Concerned Scientists. And my job is to do research and communication of that research to decision makers, to the media, to the public, and to think about how science is used and misused in policymaking. And so as it relates to the topic of this conversation, a lot of my job is tracking and talking about the impacts of federal actions that misuse science and harm people. And so what we try to do is look at federal policy actions and what the impacts will be on people, who will be affected by that, what is the meaning of some of the things that we're seeing that are making headlines. And we also try to include things that aren't making headlines. So some things that we think are a big deal in terms of ways that science is being misused at the federal level, even if it's not, being sort of widely talked about in the national conversation. So I'm going to put in the chat a link to some of that work, which is, this is where we are tracking federal attacks on science and looking at their impacts. We're up to more than 160 attacks on science since the beginning of 2017. So this is a lot of times that we feel like science was misused and that has harmed or will harm people in this country. So that's a lot of what we're doing. And in thinking about environmental justice, we have come across that in a couple ways. So part of it is this assessment of looking at impacts. As we know, and as we'll talk about more in this session, a lot of the impacts of federal actions are going to disproportionately harm environmental justice communities, fence line communities, other marginalized groups. And so that's one big focus that we've looked at around some of the federal attacks on science. And then we've also done a lot of work with communities directly. Another part of the Center for Science and Democracy's work is to increase access to science, ensure that science is being used for the public good at the local level as well. And so we've done some work working directly with communities to do scientific analyses that provide the scientific backing for what communities often already know, which is that they are facing disproportionate impacts from cumulative impacts of air pollution and other environmental hazards. And so we've done some analyses with communities to make clear and give the scientific evidence for that background. And then that's been used in media or with decision makers or with companies to ensure that they have all the information that's relevant when they're making decisions that are going to affect local communities. So I think I'll probably stop there for now, but that's some of the ways that we intersect with environmental justice issues.
Great, thanks, Gretchen. David?
Thanks, Rebecca. David Barron, I'm the managing attorney of the Washington, D.C. office of Earthjustice, which is an environmental law firm. I'm calling in today from my home in Maryland, just outside of the District of Columbia. And we sue people. We sue mostly the government for failing to live up to its obligations to protect people in environmental justice communities and elsewhere from dangerous pollutants, from other environmental hazards, and to protect lands and wildlife that are important to everyone from people who visit parks to tribes and Native Americans who view these lands as and wildlife as sacred to them and their ancestors. I came to environmental justice kind of as a natural progression of my work in environmental law. I've been doing this work for more than 40 years. And I think in my first environmental public interest job, it was in Arizona. And the injustice of our of the way that we handle pollution problems in this country was really brought home to me there when I was in Tucson, and there was a serious groundwater contamination problem discovered on the south side of Tucson, which is predominantly Latinx community, where aircraft companies had for many years been using dangerous solvents, which were just dumped on the ground and got into the groundwater. And these were cancer-causing substances that were then getting into people's drinking water. This was not a problem on the north side of Tucson, which is predominantly white and well off. And it just dramatically brought home in a local way how differently people experienced their environment and what kinds of hazards they faced based on where they lived, their economic status, and their racial backgrounds. And ever since then, I've been really focused in my environmental work on issues involving protecting people's health and the environment, particularly in those communities that are disproportionately impacted. At Earthjustice, we focus on this kind of work in both at the local level and nationally. Locally, we're representing communities, fence-line communities in some of the most polluted places in the country that are, in some cases, surrounded by chemical plants, refineries, and other dangerous industries. We're also working with communities that are suffering from sewage overflows due to inadequate or non-existent sewer systems that lead to backups into homes, into yards, into waters, where they're facing very direct and severe health threats that just ought not to be happening this day and age. We're working nationally to secure stronger standards across the country for major industries like petrochemical plants, refineries, steel mills, power plants, pulp mills, and other industries that emit dangerous toxic pollutants every day, disproportionately in communities of color and low-income communities. And we're working to secure stronger national protections against chemical disasters, explosions, releases of dangerous chemicals from floods and other disasters. Those are just a few examples of those things. And we do these cases nationally and locally in partnership with national, local environmental groups, environmental justice groups, and health organizations. So that's just a nutshell of where we're coming from on this.
Great. Thank you, David. And I guess I should give folks too a little bit about how I arrived at this work as well. I grew up in Baltimore City, and so a lot of issues around lead poisoning and lead pipes in my high school, and so that's sort of my background and growing up as really learning urban environmentalism early, and the information not getting to impacted communities, and very, very clear racial segregation within Baltimore City. And then, of course, in graduate school, Dr. Wilson was my graduate school advisor. So this symposium, it's really a labor of love for everybody involved, and it's just been an honor to have been a part of it since the beginning. And so just so folks know, I like to give, of course, the footnote that Dr. Wilson was my advisor in graduate school, and so honored that we can still work together. I've seen a whole bunch of people join since we started, so I am going to just invite everyone, if you'd like to turn on your camera and be part of this discussion with us, and also feel free to use the chat to ask your questions throughout. So just want to invite everyone in to be a part of this conversation as Gretchen and David walk through some of the rollbacks that they're going to talk about today. So just moving along into really, we're going to just kick it off really with the meat or the tofu of the conversation, which is these rollbacks. And in July, which was eons ago at this point, the New York Times published that the Trump administration had rolled back 68 environmental policies, with 32 rollbacks still underway, for a total of 100 environmental policy rollbacks since taking office. And Gretchen has already talked about even more of that, specific attacks on science. And so I just want to give each of you, a couple minutes to really dig in and give one or two specific examples. And then, where is that really happening, and what does that look like on the ground, and how is that impacting communities of color in areas where environmental injustice was already occurring? So Gretchen, why don't we start with you, one or two concrete examples?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned that at the end about some of the inequities that are already happening, because a lot of the rollbacks are happening exactly at a time where there's anyway inequities in who is protected by environmental policies, and we're adding onto that. Instead of addressing those inequities, we're now seeing some policies that are worsening them. So that is another dimension of this that's happening. So I want to focus on two things that I think are not getting the same kind of attention that other rollbacks are getting. So one, I think, is the capacity issue. So there's, broadly speaking, people leaving federal agencies, and that is true at the Environmental Protection Agency, and it's true in the Environmental Justice Office of EPA. And that lack of people power is going to have really big impacts down the road because of all the things that they're not going to be able to do now, even if, or even if we get an administration that wants to prioritize these issues, it's going to take a long time to build back that capacity, that expertise, that rebuild all the advisory committees, and making sure that they can inform the process, and that's going to be a little ways. And so I wanted to call out that as, if our problems aren't necessarily solved, even if we get an EPA administrator that wants to prioritize these issues. And so that's something that we're thinking a lot about. And how do you start to rebuild that? How do you ensure that there's a good pipeline of younger staff coming in while retaining some of the institutional expertise that has been gained over the years? So that's one piece I wanted to call out. The other one that I think is hugely important for environmental justice communities, but hasn't necessarily been talked about with that as the focus, is the particulate matter national ambient air quality standard. So these standards they're being finalized by the administration now. And earlier in the process, we made headlines when the administration killed the particulate matter review panel. So this was in 2018, this happened. It was an advisory panel made up of scientists that were set to inform the standards. And so this seemed like just kind of a standard trying to cut science out of the process element of what the administration was doing. But that actually will have big impacts on how the rule happened and how how protective it's going to be for environmental justice communities. Particulate matter is a big problem in lots of places. It's a pollutant that we know has hotspots, and some communities get far higher levels, harmful levels of particulate matter than others. And in my opinion, that meant that we should tighten the standard, because we're seeing more and more evidence that there are harms happening below the current standards. And this is one harm that I'm especially concerned about is premature death. So people dying earlier because of exposure to particulate matter. And this is of even more interest now, since COVID, we know we're starting to see signs that particulate matter exposure could be an exacerbating factor in how severe cases of COVID-19 are for people. And so, that might mean if you are exposed to more pollution over your lifetime, you might be more likely to have a severe case of the virus. And so that when they cut that panel, they stopped. They didn't get that same sort of science input and that advice on what would be protective of public health. And so they moved forward and through the process anyway. But that panel of scientists decided to meet anyway. And when they met anyway, they gave the advice to the EPA, even though the EPA said, we don't want you to. And that was this really remarkable thing that they did, and they just volunteered their time and expertise. But one thing I wanted to call out is that in their advice to Administrator Wheeler, they said there needs to be a bigger discussion of environmental justice in this rule. And they asked for that. And normally in the process, if the panel asked for that, if they hadn't been dismissed by EPA, then the EPA would have to do it, right? They'd have to say, okay, in the next draft, we're going to do a bigger, better discussion of environmental justice. And that's normally how the process works. It's sort of this public peer review of the science of what would be protective of public health. But since they had dismissed that panel, the EPA didn't take that advice. They didn't do it because we never did a second draft. They had dismissed the panel, so they didn't get to do that. And so then in the end, when the administrator looked at all the science, there wasn't that discussion of environmental justice in there. And in the proposed rule that came out a few months ago, he didn't mention environmental justice or at-risk groups at all. And so this is a huge oversight. And so just that wonky dismissal of the science had an impact on what the rule is going to be in the end, because we didn't even get to have that conversation about what are the impacts on these groups. And that's a big problem too, because in the law, they have to set the standards at a place that protects public health, including at-risk groups. And so what you would want is a very thorough discussion of what groups are more affected by particulate pollution, what are the health effects, and so that's another example of a lot of these kinds of higher level policy changes that will actually have on the ground impacts in communities, but we might not see it yet, or it's not necessarily being framed that way. And I think there's going to be several examples like that.
And I can only imagine if they actually took into consideration, took the advice of the rebellious scientists that met anyway, incorporating environmental justice into a PM NACs decision would have implications for other NACs. It's not, the ozone has a lot of the same considerations. And so if we could set the precedent, to advise the agency to better incorporate environmental justice into these decision-making processes, then first of all, that is the true mission of the EPA. They'd be fulfilling that mission to protect human health. But then also it would have, I think, it would set a good precedent for consideration of setting standards for other national ambient air quality standards, because the EPA is going through the same process for ozone as well. And there was just a big study that came out recently that talked about the impacts to pregnancy outcomes because of heat and air pollution. And unfortunately, to no one's surprise, Black and brown moms had worse health outcomes based on those two exposures that they looked at. And so I'll try to chat that study, and it's an open source journal. So I'll type that into the chat box. But just that I thank you for bringing those two examples to everyone's attention. And David, I'll ask you to do the same to provide some examples of where the rollbacks are happening and how this is impacting folks.
Well, Rebecca, I'm going to break the rules here because I can't just limit myself to one or two. We have sued this administration over 100 times for trying to roll back and weaken environmental protections or failing to perform its responsibilities to protect people from dangerous pollution. And so it's hard to just talk about one or two. I'll try to not to go too far, but um, uh, just as a preface to this, um, this administration has gone beyond any I can remember, not just in terms of rolling back protections, but in trying to pretend they're not doing that. And saying that what they're doing is being more efficient, more cost effective, and all of that, when what's really going on is that they're making it easier for polluters to pollute and not put in the kinds of protections that the law requires. One of the most glaring examples of these rollbacks is the rollback, the weakening of the chemical disaster rule, which was completed earlier this year and which we are challenging. There are over a 10-year period that was measured, something like more than 2,000 of these fires, explosions, leaks, similar incidents that have led to deaths, evacuations, exposures of people to dangerous chemicals. Long overdue is a set of regulations to require planning and protective measures to prevent these things. The Obama administration took some important steps in that direction, and when this administration came into office, they tried to stop those from going into effect. We got that overturned, and then more recently, they just rolled back most of those protections that were previously adopted. And that's just not irresponsible. It's illegal and arbitrary. But meanwhile, we have people in communities that we work with who seemingly on a weekly or monthly basis are exposed to these kinds of incidents. And you can just imagine how scary and horrifying that is to a parent who's got a kid outside playing in the schoolyard, or, well, these days playing in the backyard, and then seeing the smoke coming up from the chemical plant or factory nearby, and getting an evacuation order. And particularly these days, where are you going to go? It's just one of the most inexcusable, irresponsible things that this administration has done. And then we have this backdoor attempt by the administration to undermine limits adopted during the prior administration on toxic emissions of mercury and other dangerous pollutants from coal-fired power plants. That rule has already been implemented by almost all of the power companies. So it's already in place, saving an estimated 11,000 lives a year. And yet this crowd has come up with by trying to cook the books to say it's not worth the cost. We're challenging that in court, but it's almost a situation where ideology is taking precedent over reality, and more importantly, taking precedent over human lives. They've also come up with a not very well known or publicized effort to literally exempt thousands of factories, industrial facilities, chemical plants from having to comply with national emission limits on toxic pollutants. And I won't go into the details of that, but it's another one of these very wonky rules that results in companies being exempt from regulation. And then we have this astonishing rule that rolls back clean car standards, which will massively increase, or at least stop our progress toward cutting carbon pollution and climate change that is so has already having devastating impacts. We're seeing it every day now. The fires in California, the increase in hurricanes along the Gulf Coast, the hotter summers, and that are just so dangerous to many people, particularly senior citizens and those who have previous ailments. And then yet another attempt is to reinstate a defense for polluters that was largely eliminated during the Obama administration, or at least significantly eliminated during the Obama administration. A defense that polluters were allowed to use to claim that their violation of pollution standards was due to a malfunction in their pollution equipment. Well, under environmental law, there is no such thing as a malfunction defense. You're required to have in place pollution controls that meet standards all the time. And if your equipment doesn't function properly, despite everything that you've done, you've taken all the correct steps, that can go into that can be a factor in terms of whether you get penalized or how much you get penalized. But it doesn't exempt you from meeting standards. And the result of this defense is in some communities, particularly environmental justice communities, makes it very hard for officials or residents to enforce against these facilities. I could go on for much longer, but I've already been on my soapbox too long, so I'll turn it back to you, Rebecca.
I think this is a conference for soapboxes, so I am all for it. We got a question, I think it's a really good one, about the recent environmental justice law that just passed in New Jersey, which a lot of folks are holding up, as an example of environmental justice legislation. First, sorry, David, I had a question for you. You mentioned that you sued this administration 100 times. How does that compare to other administrations? Just so we understand, like, where is that on the scale?
I don't have the numbers from the prior administration, but it's way over.
Okay. Just I wanted to give people a comparison. So much more. Got it. So I just wanted to know if either of you had looked at the New Jersey legislation and had the specific question is if you know how health impacts are evaluated. If you know how health impacts are evaluated and what is the trigger point for denying an air permit. And you both work on the federal level, so maybe haven't looked closely at the New Jersey bill yet.
Yeah, I don't know that specific answer, but I think that is a really important question to be asking, because we know that a lot of the challenges come when you get down to that permitting level, and I'm assuming the person who asked that knows that too. But there's the New Jersey bill. I really liked how they defined I think they call it overburdened communities, and it incorporates several factors, and it has ways of triggering that definition, meaning certain actions will take place. So I think I thought it was a really great start to a lot of these issues, and thinking about how to really link up what are the impacts, what is the evidence, with actually doing something about it on the policy front. But I agree that probably the details matter, in that when we get how is it really going to be implemented when we get down to the permitting level, and thinking about exactly how whether that's going to be an inclusive process that involves communities in meaningful ways. And so hopefully it continues that. I don't know if David, you have anything else or anyone else?
I don't have anything to add on that.
Yeah, and I did just this past Thursday afternoon, I listened to a great webinar. I think a lot of the organizers behind that bill are speaking out right now about how to replicate that success. And first of all, it took them a long time. This was a long time community-driven effort. So it definitely took them, they were persistent. Another thing that came up relevant to the specific question is that the bill as written does not, impact these mundane. A lot of the opposition, what they'll bring up is like, oh, so like every time I make a small permit change or make a, this, they want me to include environmental justice every single time, and it's so burdensome and it's going to cost me so much money and so many jobs. And they just found that that's not, 10 years. Thanks, Bernice. I thought it was 10 years, but I didn't want to make up a number. And so it is definitely a marathon. But yeah, they were these bigger building of facilities, bigger expansions of facilities. So there does have to be a specific trigger point, put in those bills. And I can tell you from working on a similar effort for a couple of years in Maryland, it is hard work, and you will get opposition from unexpected places, and you will get, we attempted to change the language every single year to try to narrow the scope of the bill, to try to appease the opposition and the regulatory agencies in order to at least have a starting point, pass something, have a starting point, build from there. But the opposition didn't get any less vehement. So I would, so stick to your guns is what I would say. And like, go for the way that you originally envisioned the bill, because that's probably the right path. And if you stick with it, and engage the community. Dr. Wilson gave me some sage advice when I was working on that legislation, which is the advocacy community can't outpace the community leadership. That if, I was a paid full-time lobbyist ready to go on this issue, but without the without community building, without capacity support, it wasn't going to be successful, because elected officials really do need to hear from their communities, and as with all environmental justice initiatives, should be community driven and community led. And I'll try to, there's a good question. I don't know about if there was a recording from that. Usually they send it to my, you send it to your email if there's a recording. I don't have it yet, but I definitely have some articles on the New Jersey bill that I can try to put into the, chat. And if anybody else has resources on the New Jersey bill that you want to put into the chat, please do. And then the only other thing I'll add on this question about specific examples of rollbacks is, it's not quite a rollback. It's this new executive order on combating, it's called the Executive Order on Combating Race and Sex Stereotyping. And it is, what it does in essence is prohibit racial sensitivity training, or any, anti-racist or diversity, equity, inclusion training. So that's what it serves to do. And, is of course relevant to us working in the environmental field, because it applies to all the federal agencies working, attempting to work on environmental justice initiatives. And in prepping for this panel, I read the executive order, and I can put it in the chat, but it is, it was very, very difficult to read, because it does not feel like, and this is what David was saying, it's like the administration is acting like they're doing something really good and honorable and patriotic. And in reading it, it feels like it came from a think tank. It probably did, came from a really, really right-wing think tank, because they call systemic racism destructive ideology. They call it malign ideology, migrating from the fringes of American society. I mean, that's in an executive order, which is just, it really bothered me and made me feel yucky when I read it. But I'll type it in, but I encourage you to take a look at it, because it really is, they intentionally quote and cite some social justice heroes. And I think in doing so misrepresent, their true purpose, and also talk about the way that our Constitution was written, that all people are created equal. But what they don't talk about is that the Constitution also says that enslaved people are valued at 3/5 of a white person. That is in our Constitution, and we are actively working in all fields against that ingrained ideology in this nation. And so to say that racism is not baked into our country, that is a misrepresentation of our history. And it is critical that as we work on rolling out environmental policies, that we take that active racial healing, anti-racist approach. And David, you already said soapbox. I'm clearly on mine, so I'll calm down. But I'm going to put this in the chat box and encourage everybody to take a look. Gretchen or David, any other comments on specific rollbacks before we jump to, we're going to transition a little bit into solutions.
No, I think that's a good point. One other point I was just going to say on the executive order that I haven't really seen it framed this way, but in addition to obviously being, morally inappropriate and outright censorship of agencies, I think I would argue it also makes all of the federal government less effective in their job, because their missions are to protect people, to serve people, to think about public health and safety. And in a nation where there are great inequities in who is benefiting from those services, if they do not have that history and that understanding of those inequities, of these kinds of issues and bias and anti-racism training, they're going to be less effective at being able to address those inequities, which they should be doing. So that's another point on that.
I think we're seeing a number of other kinds of these sort of broad brush attempts to affect how federal agencies do their business in ways that are harmful to the cause of environmental justice. In addition to the one that you've been talking about, Rebecca, there's another one that EPA is considering now. They proposed it earlier this year, that mandates a cost-benefit analysis for major new rules to limit air pollution. And what's really remarkable about this proposal is that it requires a cost-benefit analysis for air pollution rules, even where Congress has specifically said that cost cannot be considered, that the rule must be focused solely on protection of health. That's the only consideration allowed under the law, and yet EPA is proposing to require in those situations that there be a cost-benefit analysis. And we're obviously arguing that that's illegal, and will almost certainly be challenging it if and when it's finalized. But the other concern there is that that the way they're doing this is elevating cost over protection of people, and elevating willingness to pay over protection of people. And this has been one of the excuses that our establishment has used for decades, that for not providing the health and environmental protections that communities need and deserve.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important, that's a good transition to the next question, which is, and I read and commented on that rule, because for health professionals, it's critical that these, non-energy benefits, for example, these kind of health co-benefits of these environmental regulations and landmark, pieces of legislation are incorporated into the benefit side of the cost benefit analysis. Because if you incorporate health co-benefits, it's a huge cost savings and benefit. So thank you for bringing up that additional example. But it transitions well into the next question, which is about what recourse communities who are adversely affected by environmental hazards have to protect themselves. What options do these communities have to stave off the negative impacts of these hazards? And so what can communities do right now as they're looking at these rollbacks and seeing the impacts in their communities?
Yeah, I don't want to focus exclusively on the doom and gloom elements of this, because there's definitely things that can be done. I think we do need to think about what are the bigger impacts and what are the long-term impacts that we're maybe not seeing yet. But I think there is a lot that we can do to do a lot. Obviously, staying civically engaged, following processes, showing up for public comments and permitting processes and hearings and things like that are a big part. Legal action, as you've heard David mention a few times, this is can be really impactful, and especially if you win, of course. And so that's a big way that we can fight some of these rollbacks. Another thing that I would just add generally is that I think it's sort of easy to be focused on the federal pieces, but there are a lot of things that we can do at lower levels of government or do to put pressure on companies. So I think there's a lot that we can do that, and that they often aren't in a position to be able to undo some of the federal harm that's happened or some of the rules, but they can at least buffer against it or do some things that maybe counteract it or limit what the local impact of it is. So I think there's still a lot of space to do those kinds of things. I'm on a public advisory committee for the DC region on air pollution and climate. And so there's a lot locally that's happening, and different jurisdictions are doing all kinds of things to address some of these issues. And I think, there's a lot we can do in our neighborhoods, our cities, our states to try to think about ways to address some of these issues. And also to put pressure on companies, because they of course have a huge amount of power on a lot of this, and they are choosing what to do and not do and deciding how transparent they're going to be. So I think there continues to be ways that we can help make sure that they're being good actors and working with communities and putting pressure on them, whether it's the carrot or the stick, whether it's working with them, engaging them to do things, or shaming them if they don't. I think that continues to be another path that communities can do. I think too, a lot of things that even if some things can't happen now, we can think about, what can we be doing to prepare for when there is the political moment to do things. So, what kind of data can we be collecting? What sort of arguments and analyses can we be developing, or what sorts of information do we need that will position us in a good place to make the case for changes when it is a good political moment. So those are the kinds of things that I would say, and I'd invite anybody else in the chat as well to weigh in.
Yeah, I would add, obviously vote, but not just vote, but get these politicians, especially on the local level, not just federal, but the local level, the local politicians, Congress people, state senators, county council people, and make some good trouble with them, as John Lewis used to say. Make some good trouble. Make them hear you, because it's a lot of times I've talked to these local politicians and state politicians, and a lot of times their constituents don't even know who they are. And if they're getting mail and calls and letters from people complaining about the kinds of problems we've been talking about, there's at least a chance they'll do something about it. I don't want to be Pollyannish about this. I mean, there are a lot of them who are just tone deaf and they're going to get anywhere with them, but you're certainly not going to get anywhere with them if they're not hearing from you. And and not just vote, but make sure that your neighbors and others in your community are getting out and voting too, because that's just a real important way to be heard. That was one of the things Barack Obama emphasized recently in some of his talks about anti-racism, and getting involved is just really valuable. The other thing is to support environmental justice groups that are working locally. There are a lot of really excellent, very effective environmental justice community groups that are great at organizing and pushing leaders to take action, and they need your support in your community, and that can be one of the most effective things you can do to organize and as a group be heard.
Yeah, I think that's thank you both. I think those are really tangible recommendations. And there was another related question that came in about staying civically engaged, and specifically in order to fight these rollbacks, but has a number of other benefits. But how, what specifically, where do you get your news these days? As many news outlets can be exhausting to watch the news outlets. It's less news and more commentary. So, where do you get your news, and how do you protect yourself against burnout and against compassion fatigue in this process? I think it's a really important question. And listening to the youth panel this morning, also, they talked about not doing this work not as a job but as a lifestyle, which I think so many of us can relate to. And I wanted to ask them about burnout too, because I said, yeah, yes, please, we need you, but take care of yourselves also, because burnout is real. So where do you get your news, and how are you protecting yourself against burnout?
Yeah, that's such a good question, because it is such an important point. And before I answer, I do just want to acknowledge my privilege as a white person, and thus I probably approach this differently, and I want to acknowledge that. But I try to follow. I do a lot through social media and follow people on Twitter and Facebook that I want to interact with, and don't follow things that I don't want to interact with. And so I think a lot of times we feel a lot of pressure to hear what the other side's saying and like get diverse perspectives. But I sort of feel like on your own, you can make your own choices about what you want to be exposed to, and whether that is you find that helpful. But if it is like having a negative mental health effect on you, I don't think that you need to expose yourself to different things. Maybe if you're running for office in a swing state, you have to do those kinds of things regularly, but I don't feel a need to do it in my daily life. So I think that's one thing that I do. And another thing on these issues, on environmental justice, and this has already come up a little in the chat, is we know these issues are often not front page news, right? It's not necessarily prioritized on major outlets. So I try to make sure that I'm also following, to get these kinds of issues, I try to make sure I'm following outlets that do put more time and effort into community storytelling and thinking about some of those issues. The Intercept is one that I think does a good job of this. So they have a lot of like really in-depth, Sharon Lerner there specifically, they do a lot of in-depth following of communities and chemical impacts. They've done a lot of great work now around PFAS chemicals and ethylene oxide, and different ways that communities are fighting issues. And so I think finding the people and the outlets that are doing better coverage on these issues can be really helpful. And I try to also just always remember that like the only factor is not how big of an outlet it is, and that is not a measure of importance, because it is sort of easy, especially in this current media environment with a lot of things happening in the federal government, especially in recent weeks and probably the pre-election conversations. So I try to remember to make sure that these issues aren't backburnered, and that we need to prioritize thinking about some of these things, even if we're not getting sort of that external signal that it's important by either seeing it on the front page or getting a lot of responses if I post it on social media, right? Because it might not get the same amount of engagement, but it is important to remember to focus there.
And if I can just stick with you for just a minute, I know we talked in preparing for this talk about the importance of childcare, in particularly in supporting working women, but really, just family leave and, you've been catapulted into a leadership role in this space recently. So I just wanted to ask you to comment also on the importance of paid family leave on, childcare and supporting, women in STEM in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good point, that we shouldn't overlook the current situation that many people are in right now if you are parents or caregivers. We've already seen the jobs report from last week that said women are leaving the workforce at 4 times the rate that men are. And a big part of that is this lack of support for caregiving and parenting support and childcare support, which we already know fall disproportionately to women and women of color. So that's going to have an effect on our ability to do this work and to do it well. So I think that's another challenge that we should be thinking about. I'm very concerned with what that's going to do for a lot of careers for people, especially in this space where we really need a lot of diverse voices and perspectives. And we want to make sure that we're not losing a lot of progress that we've made in recent years in getting a lot of different prominent voices on climate and air pollution and other environmental justice work. So that's one thing that I've been working on. I had a viral tweet, that's what Rebecca's referring to, where I just showed my a clip of me on CNN and then what my living space actually looked like, which was surrounded by toys and this very chaotic environment. And that's the reality, of course, for many of us who are trying to juggle childcare and work right now. And so I think that is just another challenge related to the work too. I'll put it in the chat, but I did an interview talking about how that's going to impact the work, because I think, there's more work than ever on these topics, and a significant part of the leaders on these issues are people that are also trying to juggle childcare and women. So I think that's something that we need to just keep in mind. And, I think that's probably a balance of demanding things from decision makers and employers and making sure that they are accommodating us, and also forgiving ourselves if we're not able to perform and do the work at the same pace that we were previously.
Thanks, Gretchen. David, what are you doing to avoid? You mentioned earlier you've been in this work for more than 40 years. So what is your advice for making this a marathon?
I just have one piece right now, which is I have found that taking a few days off from the news every once in a while, it can be really helpful. Just focus on something else. Don't look at the headlines. Don't try to follow every moment of what's going on. Because if you're in it for the long term, and you get caught up in the daily headlines, you're going to it's really going to be hard on you. And so I do that periodically.
I saw Vernice's head nod when you said that, and if she's agreeing with you, then it's probably really good advice. So
I'd be interested in hearing from Vernice about what she has done to avoid more. She's been doing this forever, and Vernice, you have any words of wisdom on this?
Well, first I want to say, Gretchen, I so loved that shot when they pulled back and showed what was really going on in your house. And it was so liberating to me. I was like, because my house is a freaking mess, and it's been a mess for 6 months, and I don't have any kids. So, but that you let them do that, or your husband did that, it was a wonderful and liberating thing. David, to your question, I try to lift up the victories wherever they are. So even in the midst of this madness, and I want to say that to David's admonition, I would probably add, get off Twitter for a few days, but I, for some reason, am addicted to Twitter. I don't know why. It's the first thing I do when I get up and the last thing I do when I go to sleep. But I want to say that I follow Earthjustice on Twitter. And not a freaking day goes by that there is not a post from Earthjustice about something else, that not the litigation that they filed the day before, but something else they filed that night, right? And it gives me so much energy to know that they are out there fighting every day. And a whole bunch of our colleagues are doing that. But then there's some victories like the New Jersey Cumulative Impacts Bill, right? That people worked 10 years to get passed, and they got that passed. There's victories like the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals decision in Friends of Buckingham County versus Virginia DEQ that the Southern Environmental Law Center brought on behalf of the Union Hill community, historic African-American community in Buckingham County, Virginia, against the siting of a compressor station for the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. Then there was a period of about 2.5 weeks over the summer, I want to say it was in June, where pipeline after pipeline after pipeline got destroyed. And I don't mean destroyed as in blown up. I mean destroyed as in their approval process got denied by either an appellate court or a state court or some jurisdiction because of the advocacy that people have been doing. And I remember when the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, it happened over the 4th of July weekend. I was having a socially distanced, tiny little barbecue that included Dr. Adrian Hollis from Union of Concerned Scientists and Jackie Patterson from the NAACP and Leslie Fields from the Sierra Club and my friend Dana Matthew, who's the Dean of George Washington Law School. And we were just sitting there, spaced out, eating crabs, having a good time. It was the day after the 4th of July, so the 5th of July. And my phone started blowing up with text messages from the folks from Union Hill and across Virginia about the denial and the pullback of that permit to go ahead and build the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. Oh my God. I don't know that I have ever been so happy. I mean, really, I don't know that I have ever been so happy because I know what people were doing to fight that pipeline. The mobilization and the grassroots advocacy, along with all of the friends of, if you want to see, get your heart lifted up, go and look at that decision from the Fourth Circuit, but also look at the filing from the Southern Environmental Law Center and see all of the organizations that were friends of, that wrote friends of briefs to support the folks in Union Hill. It was an extraordinary piece of organizing. I really, in my 35 years of doing this work, I don't think I've ever seen a more diverse group of people of every stripe, of every background come together to fight that pipeline, but also to stand with the people of Union Hill, which is a historic, Freedmen's established, one of the last 45 remaining African-American communities established after the end of slavery, after the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation to establish free Black communities. Union Hill is one of those places. It just lifted my heart. So I say all of that to say, yeah, there's a lot of craziness going on, but people are throwing down. All along the way, people are throwing down, and there are victories that are happening all along the way. And so, you know, if the federal stuff is weighing heavy on you, as it does on me most days, look at what our folks are doing in communities. Look at what the River Keepers are doing, right? So earlier this year, the River Keepers Alliance in North Carolina and EJ groups and civil rights groups beat back a rule and a process to not treat and properly dispose of coal ash that has been generated by Duke Power, right? They slayed Duke Power, but whoever knew that the River Keepers and the civil rights folks and the EJ folks would come together and would result in such an extraordinary victory. So people are doing really good work. You know, even though these are difficult times, you cannot lose hope. And, you know, if you really, really need some inspiration, look back at some of the films from the civil rights movement or the early labor movement, you know, where people were beat to death for standing up for their rights, where people were really, really, really up against it. And not saying that we're not up against it, but we're not up against it in the same way. And know that there are people who came before us who fought for us to have the space that we have right now. And if we just stand on their shoulders and don't bend and do what David says, show up to vote and take everybody you know to vote, make sure everybody is registered to vote, have a plan to vote, right? In Maryland, let me just say this last thing. So in Maryland, for the people who live in Maryland, since this is a University of Maryland sponsored conference, none of our regular polling sites will be open on election day. None of them, none. There will be 315 new polling spaces opened where people can go and vote socially distanced, right? So you can't usually do that in our regular polling spaces. Nobody knows that. I just happened to read that in the New York Times. No freaking body in Maryland has officially told us that we are not going to be able to vote at our usual polling sites. So get your ballot now, fill out your ballot, find out where the official drop-off locations are and take it there, or take it to the post office, but you got to vote. You got to vote, right? That's the one powerful thing we can do to fight back against this madness. And so I'll leave it there. And, stay off Twitter, stay off the news, do stuff with your family, listen to music. I've been listening to a lot of music. It's been a great summer for music. And just do some other things, because the battle is going to have to be waged all over again come January 20th, right? When we start anew. And put back the stuff that we've lost and then get some more good stuff.
Yeah, and just to remember that not voting is a vote. People talk about choosing, like, oh, I can't, I don't really like either of them, I'm not going to vote. That's a vote. That is an active decision. And we have, so just cheering on what Vernice was saying, to vote and bring everybody, so thank you, Vernice, for your wisdom today and always.
My pleasure.
We want to, the next question is about environmental issues as have become so partisan. The US, we're in a two-party system. I mean, that's where, that's where we are right now. It really, the question is, it works against us to have conservatives labeled environmental issues belonging to the left, right? So we won't make progress on climate action until everyone owns the causes and solutions. So how can we do better? What is your advice? How can we work to make environmental issues, to make climate change? I work on climate change all the time. That is my job, and it is also a lifestyle, as the youth said this morning. I have started composting during the pandemic, but it is a partisan issue. And normally we had this talk on what C3 and C4 organizations can do during election season, and normally saying something like vote climate is vote for the environment. That's very much C3. It's an issue. It's education. However, we're at a point where the party platforms on that issue are so polar opposite that it becomes on the edge of lobbying. It becomes an issue, and that's rough, because it's it can be seen as an endorsement of the Democratic Party of the left if you're saying vote climate or vote environment, because we've come to a point of such polarization on the issues. And so I think it's a really great question. I see, Maria, you turned on your
I turned on my camera. I just think it's so important, and I feel like on all these conferences we are just talking to ourselves. And if somebody, we just make the assumption now that there's nobody who's not, a Democrat on this call, right? Like, we just make that assumption. And I think it's a fair one, because if somebody were on the right, they would look at the agenda and they would assume that we were going to be slamming the right. And I've been, almost every environmental advocacy call I've been on, we do slam the right, and I just feel like we have to do better to make it like that. We're like, the messenger wasn't like, a lot of people in Florida don't accept that climate change is real because Al Gore was the messenger, right? So how can we change that? We have to change it. It cannot be that we own this issue. We don't own this issue. It's everybody's issue. And I just feel like, we have to have conferences that are more inclusive. We invite maybe moderate Republicans who are in states that are being pummeled by, like Florida, that are being pummeled, Louisiana pummeled by climate change issues. I just feel like we have to do better to do that.
Yeah, and thank you for that question. It is something. No, we think a lot about it at ecoAmerica, because that's what we do, is to try to engage folks in the movable middle, right? Like folks who are moderate. And then, there was an elected official in Maryland who used to say to me, I don't know when did conservation make its way out of the conservative party?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
With me.
Yeah.
as a, you know, so anyway.
I think that also faith communities, like, you know, the Catholic community, you know, I think that, and I feel strongly about this, I'm Greek Orthodox, and you know, our patriarch has a beautiful encyclical on the environment. The Pope has an amazingly beautiful encyclical on the environment. And yet, for some reason, that's not emphasized. You know, this is, you know, this is for all of us. You know, this is our common home. This is our environment. I just think that we could do better to make it not just a left issue. And I think until we do, we're not getting anywhere. And I'll get off my soapbox. Thanks.
One thing I might add, I think this is a really good discussion, and you know, there's a lot to unpack there. One thing I'm going to put in the chat is the most recent podcast episode from Dr. Ayana Johnson's podcast on climate change. They did a brief history of Republicans on climate and how, you know, it wasn't always partisan, and sort of how recent a lot of that history is. So if you don't have a lot of time, that's like a really good sort of summary, I think, of where we are. And importantly, they end on hope on that, and how much we've sort of made climate more of a national issue now, and it's getting more traction than it has. The other sort of broader point I just would make on this is that, you know, I think there's sort of a tendency that we all just, it's so infuriating that people don't care about the issue or accept the science on these issues, that we tend to sort of focus on that. But that's not necessarily, you know, the target isn't that we get everyone's, you know, uncle to understand the science, right? And that's not really how political action has happened historically. And so I think it's tempted to really just focus on like deniers and those barriers. But there's actually a lot we can do without getting them on board, right? It's not that you have to get 100% of the public to agree with you. And so I think that's something that we should keep in mind, that it's about putting policy pressure in appropriate places and leveraging actions and getting the right stakeholders on board. And so it's not necessarily convincing everyone. And so I think there's a lot of action we can do in that vein. The other broader point I was going to make was just around, I think the politics look really different when you get to local issues on this. And, you know, everyone, it's been said, you know, conservatives are less concerned with this, but NIMBYism is of every political variety. And so nobody wants a plant in their backyard. And so if we can leverage communities that might not be on board with the broader environmental justice movement, but have a facility they are concerned about near them, then, you know, we can try to work with those communities to get bigger actions. And there have been cases where that's successfully happened. So I just wanted to flag there. I think there are opportunities locally sometimes that don't fall on partisan lines.
And David, your thoughts, and then I'll chime in with some more.
Well, I just want to echo what Gretchen said about the history of the Republican Party was not until recently one of anti-environmentalism. To the contrary, it was Richard Nixon who created the EPA, and he was, you know, not a flaming liberal by any means. The major clean water legislation of the 1970s and even the 1990 Clean Air Act Amendment was bipartisan. The 1990 Clean Air Act amendments were signed by the first President Bush. So this is a fairly recent development. And to me, there are two factors that have been driving this. One is money in politics. The money in politics on the particularly on the anti-environmental side is coming from industries that are regulated, and they are pushing this anti-environmental agenda. And look who is getting appointed to the agencies under this administration and prior Republican. It's been people from industry or attorneys for industry, or attorneys allied with industry. And I trace a lot of that back to money in politics. So I think part of the effort here, not all of it, but part of it needs to be focused on getting a handle on that issue. And I know the Supreme Court gave us a big setback in Citizens United. but we can't let that go. We can't view that as an issue of other significance. It is critical significance on environmental justice issues. The second piece is I agree with the comment that we need to start communicating and talking not just to ourselves, but to those who don't agree with us on everything, because I see a lot of this coming not from common sense, not from, a sense that environmental protection is not a Republican issue. It's an ideology that is driving this, an ideology that government is bad, that we have too much government, that government is limiting liberty, and we have to keep government out of our lives. And in fact, that's one of the big drivers of the climate change deniers. It's not that they really believe climate change isn't happening. It's not that they really believe it's not due to human causes. It's because they don't like the fact that the solution requires some government intervention. And we need to come up with solutions that address that concern while dealing with the problem. And we're not going to do that just by talking with ourselves.
Yeah,
Agree.
couldn't agree more with that, with the taking money out of politics and communicating, in our communications guidance, one of the really early steps is connect on common values. So what we know is when you approach somebody and you get an argument right away and think, and talk divisively at each other, your brain actually, there is research that shows that your brain shuts down and will not receive more information. So it is so important that when you're starting these conversations with folks who may be coming at it from a different angle, who may be less willing to agree with the solutions that are necessary to take, to solve these issues, that you first connect on common values, that you start with the people you're talking with and to. And I would be remiss if I didn't say, health is a major motivator to work on these issues. So once we start, and Maria, this, that.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that's, the AAP is all about pro-child, not pro-party. And I think that, that does work for our organization, right?
Yep.
It's hugely important. Yep.
Yep. I found that as well, that when I start talking about how bad my allergies have gotten, over the last couple of years living in the DC region, I didn't have allergies before. And when I talk to friends on the West Coast who say they cannot breathe inside their house and they cannot breathe outside of their house because the wildfire smoke is so pervasive, that we can have a whole conversation about impacts and solutions in a way that is relying on people's empathy. And then you pivot towards solutions and find where you have overlap, but starting by connecting on common values and where people are and talking about health impacts that are happening now to you and to your family, and storytelling. There's a health Voices for Climate Action is out there now with several new videos of folks telling their stories and what they're seeing in patients. We are up against the clock at this point, so I'm going to do a couple of lightning round questions, so quick answers before we end out the day. One is, Gretchen, there was a question about the way science is presented in the media. So this was going back a little bit to a topic earlier. Can you just give a brief comment on, sort of as you look at the science coming directly out, and then how you see it being translated in the media, particularly around environmental and EJ issues, but probably COVID is relevant, but like how is the media doing in science communication?
Yeah, it's a good question. And there's definitely a filter when things go through the media. And I think that it's getting better. We've seen sort of journalists work on it. And actually, that's a kind of a big part of my job, is to translate things for the media. And so when I get calls, like I try to always answer the phone, because if it can be if they do better on the science, and I tell other scientists to do this as well, because it is very useful if reporters can get the science right. I think on on COVID, I think it gets tricky now because a lot of this is very new science and it is very early. And I think, it's hard. Not everyone understands how how progress in science works, and that, there might be something that we think was true. There was a preliminary study that showed it, and then we have another study that shows, actually it's different. And so a lot of that, independent of this administration's fumbles around COVID response, some of that back and forth and changing of advice would have happened anyway, because this is a new virus that scientists and everyone else is just learning about, and we're trying to figure out what to do. So I think one thing I'd recommend is just trying to find reliable sources, and making sure and being sort of open to updated information, right? Because sometimes we just learn more. The most obvious example of this was in the beginning when it was sort of unclear whether wearing a mask would be useful. We now know it's very clearly useful and important, and we should do it at all times. So that's a big thing that sort of evolved as we sort of understood more about the virus. And I know we were just told to get off Twitter, but I actually find Twitter really useful for this, because there's these really great science communicators on Twitter. And so people that, will call it out if they felt like the media didn't get something right. And it's very digestible because they have to say it really quickly. And, I do some of this, and on COVID, there's a lot of really great epidemiologists. Twitter went through and blue checkmarked a bunch of epidemiologists, people that were thoughtful on COVID. And so there's a lot of people who are doing this regularly. And so that's a lot of great content to try to help you understand how good the media is doing or not on science communication.
David, do you have anything to add in particular, maybe how science, how scientists and the science is used in the law, and how important it is, for that grounding, and how you use that information?
Well, it's critical. The courts don't typically base their decisions on what Fox News is saying. They base their decisions on what's actually before them, and what was before the government agencies who made the decisions. And so it's crucial, and it's crucial that the qualified scientists are heard in the process, because if they're not, then it becomes a policy judgment of the government agency or the government official, and the courts are going to defer to that.
Yeah, great. And I know we have about 5 minutes left, so I just there's a couple questions in the chat, and thank you for folks who are already chatting answers, but about where to start when you're writing, what's the best place to start in writing an EJ plan, or if maybe you're in the beginning stages of thinking about either an agency plan or legislation, or maybe some models you have for folks to follow as they embark on some regulatory work on environmental justice. So, and this will count as your closing statement. So Gretchen, why don't you go first?
Yeah, sounds good. So I think there's a lot of resources, and I'd welcome others to put things in the chat. One thing I would add that I worked on this with Tamara Tolza-Laughlin, who some of you I think know, and we worked on this to hand to DC jurisdictional, in the region, people that were in charge of different jurisdictions. So people for the district, for different counties and towns around the broader DC metro region, and how to think about environmental justice and what they are doing, because we were focused very much on thinking about how the committee that me and her are on thinks about how to incorporate air pollution and climate advice and public input into the process. And we wanted to make sure environmental justice was centered in that, and we saw that was variable across jurisdictions, and some did a much better job than others of thinking about those issues. And so we wanted to make sure that they had the tools, the people making the decisions had the tools to think about that. So that's one thing I would suggest you check out. And I think it's a good a way to think about different ways that we can do things at the local level despite all of these federal rollbacks. So I guess I would, my closing statement would just be to don't burn out and keep thinking about different ways to move forward on this, even if, we're facing some setbacks and there's some things happening at the local, or there's things happening at the federal level that are problematic. I think there's a lot we can do in the meantime.
Great, thanks, Gretchen. And David, starting point, advice for folks, and closing statement.
When we're looking at any issue to get engaged in, I think we need to ask the question, what are the near and long-term effects of our working on this issue on the ground to real people? If we can't pinpoint that, either near term or long term, then we have to think really hard about whether this is something we want to spend our limited resources on. The other important thing that we need to do is do this in partnership with the affected communities. Is what we as like a national organization may view as a big deal may not jibe with what people at the community level are most concerned about. And so we have to hear all the voices in making the judgments about where to put our resources and how to do that to be most effective.
Yeah, and that echoes what the youth panel said this morning also about listening and being good listeners. So before the next session, folks start to invade, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to Gretchen and David, a huge thank you to the Siege Lab, to folks on the back end running everything who are already typing in the next sessions. So you have a couple minutes for a break. Thank you to our wonderful community that we created here today, for all the folks for calling in and spending part of your Saturday with us to add to this robust discussion, not just through your questions, but through your answers. It takes a village. We are in this together. Thank you to our speakers and to everyone here today. Enjoy the rest of the symposium for the rest of the day. Check out the videos online, the ones that are posted, and look forward to working with each and every one of you moving forward. So thank you.
Bye, Rebecca.